They say the tree weeps at dusk, its thick red sap bleeding like sorrow from the earth, but not everyone knows why. In a quiet village forgotten by maps, a curious girl named Eve dares to touch what should remain buried. Her footsteps awaken a silence that has slept too long, and with it, the cries of the lost begin again. As secrets unravel and the past claws its way to the surface, Eve finds herself carrying the weight of a curse born from betrayal, grief, and the voices beneath the roots. The first time Eve saw the tree, the sun had already begun to melt behind the hills, casting a copper glow over the bush path she had wandered too far down. Her sandals kicked up dust as she chased a stubborn goat that slipped through the family fence again, tugging her away from the familiar and into the forgotten. That was when she saw it, tall, twisted, and old as time itself, standing alone at the edge of a wide clearing. Its bark was cracked like dried riverbeds, and from deep within its trunk, a dark red sap oozed in slow, steady tears. It wasn't sticky like palm sap, and it didn't smell sweet. It smelled earthy, old, almost like rust. Eve stared, breath caught, unable to step closer, yet too drawn to look away. Then she heard it, a faint whisper, low and soft, almost like someone humming a sad tune beneath their breath. But there was no one there, just her, the windless evening, and the tree that bled. She backed away, heart quickening, and didn't stop running until the familiar sight of her grandmother's compound returned. That night, long after the goat had been tied and the sun had disappeared, Eve lay awake, replaying the sound. It hadn't been the wind. The tree had spoken. When morning came, Eve could barely wait to tell her grandmother what she had seen. As they sat outside, peeling yam together under the mango tree, she finally said it. "Mama, I saw a tree that bleeds like a person." The yam in her grandmother's hand slipped and fell into the dirt. For a moment, the old woman did not speak. Then, slowly, she wiped her hands on her wrapper, eyes fixed on something far beyond the horizon. "You did not touch it, did you?" Her voice was low, tight, like someone who had just remembered a nightmare. Eve shook her head, though her hand had hovered close the day before. Grandmother stood, walked to the corner of the compound, and pulled down an old calabash covered in dust. She placed it between them and said, "That tree stands where the ground should have never been disturbed. Long ago, something was buried there. Not a man, not an animal, but a secret the earth itself cannot hold without weeping." Eve's curiosity only grew, but her grandmother's face turned stern. "You must never go near that place again. Let the dead mourn in peace, and let the tree cry alone." She returned to peeling yam, her hands steady once more. But Eve could tell her grandmother was afraid, and that fear wrapped itself around Eve's thoughts, even as the sun warmed her back. Many seasons before Eve was born, a stranger had arrived in the village, tall, with a faded hat and a cutlass that gleamed too brightly for someone passing through. No one knew his name, and he never offered one. He claimed he was a trader on his way to the northern towns, but instead of continuing his journey, he lingered. He camped near the clearing, saying it was shaded and dry. The villagers watched from afar, whispering warnings that he laughed off like children's tales. Then, one afternoon, he struck the bleeding tree with his cutlass, hoping to collect the red sap he thought might be rare and valuable. The moment his blade touched the bark, the air changed. Birds scattered, and the wind fell silent. That night, he screamed until dawn. No one came to his aid. When morning broke, they found him crawling toward the village, eyes wide, his voice gone. All he could do was point back at the tree and shiver. The elders took him in, fed him, offered prayers, but he never spoke again. Days later, he vanished, leaving behind only his hat and the cutlass, now rusted and bent. From that time, the tree bled more often, especially when the moon was thin. The elders warned that something had awakened beneath its roots, and though the villagers continued their lives, they learned to walk the long way around the clearing. Some things, they said, were never meant to be disturbed. After Ife's visit to the clearing, something changed. At first, it was small, a strange chill in the air after sunset, even when the nights were warm. Then the dogs began barking at shadows, hackles raised at the empty bush. The elders tried to ignore it, calling it coincidence, but the old women who swept the compounds at dawn began whispering. They said they heard weeping in the trees, soft and sorrowful, just before the rooster crowed. One night, Ife woke suddenly to the sound of rustling leaves, though the air outside was still. She crept to the window and listened, her heart thudding in her chest. It wasn't wind. It was the same whisper she had heard at the tree, low and full of grief. A sound like someone mourning, quiet but endless. The next day, a boy who had gone hunting near the clearing returned home wide-eyed, clutching a broken arrow. He said he saw footprints in the soil, small like a child's, circling the tree, but no child was there. The village grew tense. Doors were locked before dark. Fires were burned longer. And yet, the weeping continued. The elders gathered, but offered no answers. When Ife passed them in the market, she noticed how they lowered their voices and glanced her way. They knew. Something that had once been quiet had begun to stir again, and somehow it had followed her home. In the days that followed, Ife noticed how people began to avoid her. Market women who once greeted her with warm smiles now looked away. Children no longer called her to join their games. Even her grandmother grew quieter, watching her with worry behind her kind eyes. It was during one of these silent afternoons that Ife wandered past the chief's compound, drawn by a strange rhythm in the air, not drums, but a soft thudding, like something tapping beneath the ground. She paused by the old cola tree outside his fence, just as the chief stepped out from his doorway, startled to find her standing there. His eyes, normally proud and sharp, held a flicker of fear. "Go home, child," he said, voice low and hurried. But Ife had seen the strange box he carried earlier, wrapped in faded cloth, its corners darkened with age. That night, when most had gone to sleep, Ife returned quietly, heart pounding in her chest. Through the cracks in the wall of the chief's hut, she saw him kneeling before the box, muttering words she could not understand. Then he opened it. Inside were broken beads, scraps of a child's wrapper, and something wrapped in a cloth stained deep red. He stared at them for a long time, tears in his eyes. Then he whispered, "I begged them not to do it." Ife stumbled away, unseen, the wind brushing past her like a warning. Whatever had happened long ago, the chief knew. And now, so did she. The next morning, Ife turned to the oldest woman in the village, Mama Ebele, who sat every day weaving mats under the big baobab tree. Her hands never stopped moving, but her eyes missed nothing. When Ife asked about the bleeding tree and the chief's strange box, Mama Ebele sighed and leaned back, her fingers pausing just once. "It was before your time," she began, her voice thick with memory. "There was a woman, Nana, who gave birth to twins, 2 girls as bright as the morning sun. In those days, some still whispered that twins were a curse, a sign of imbalance in the spirit world. The elders disagreed on what to do. Some wanted to celebrate. Others feared what they did not understand." Ife listened, heart heavy, as Mama Ebele continued. One night, the girls vanished. Nena screamed through the village, carrying their little wrappers in her hands. She went to the chief, to the elders, to the gods. No one spoke. But that same week, a young tree grew in the clearing where nothing had ever grown before, and soon after, the bleeding began. Ife felt a lump in her throat. Were they buried there? The old woman did not answer, only nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with tears not yet shed. "Sometimes the land cries when people won't," she said softly. "And sometimes it cries until someone finally listens." Ife knew then that the tree wasn't just mourning, It was waiting. The thought of the twins haunted Ife's every step. She saw their shadows in puddles after the rain, heard their laughter tucked behind the evening winds. No one else would speak of them. Her grandmother, when pressed again, only whispered, "Some truths will sink you if you carry them too young." But Ife could no longer turn away. On the third night after the full moon, she wrapped her shawl tight, tucked a small wooden shovel under her arm, and slipped into the dark. The path to the tree felt different now, quieter but watching. When she reached the clearing, the moon was high and pale, casting silver light across the earth. The tree stood as it always had, tall and sorrowful, its sap glistening like tears. Ife knelt beside the thickest root, where the ground looked darker than the rest. Her hands trembled as she began to dig. The soil was soft at first, almost like it wanted to give way. Inch by inch, she uncovered small signs, shards of bone, a tiny bracelet of cowrie shells, a torn wrapper faded to gray. Then, her fingers brushed something wrapped tightly in cloth. She paused, the air heavy on her skin. Gently she pulled it free. The cloth opened to reveal two small anklets, identical, delicate, and silent. As she held them, the wind picked up without warning, and from the tree came a long, low sound. Not a groan, not a cry, a breath, like something exhaling for the first time in years. Ife closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. She had found them. That night, something in the village broke open. Lanterns flickered without wind, mortars cracked without being touched, chickens refused to cluck. The air was thick, as though the sky itself was holding its breath. Ife had barely made it back from the clearing, her hands still dusted with the soil from the tree, when the howling began. It didn't come from an animal, it was the sound of a woman, deep and raw, echoing across the village like a drumbeat of grief. People emerged from their homes, afraid to speak, their eyes drawn toward the tree in the distance. Its top now seemed to sway, though no wind stirred around it. Then came the shadows, long and thin, moving across the ground like dancers with no feet. They crept through walls, curled into corners, and touched every house that once ignored the cries of the forgotten. Fires lit on their own, casting uneasy light on the compounds. The chief ran barefoot through the square, his wrapper torn, shouting words no one understood. From the forest edge, Ife stood watching, her heart pounding against her ribs. She felt no fear, only clarity. What had been buried in silence was now awake, and it would not return to sleep without truth. The anklets she carried grew cold in her hands, humming softly, as though the twins had found their voices again. The village had been warned. Now it would reckon. The elders gathered beneath the ancestral tree before first light, their faces grim and worn. None of them denied what had happened. The shadows, the flames, the cries, every elder remembered the silence they had once chosen, and now silence would no longer protect them. The chief stood in the center, clutching the blood-stained cloth from the old wooden box. His hands trembled, but his voice held steady. "We buried them not because of law, but because of fear, and fear is no offering to the gods." The oldest among them, Baba Chinedu, nodded slowly, then called for sacred items, drums, kola nuts, palm oil, goat's blood, symbols of cleansing and truth. Ife was summoned to the gathering, her presence demanded not by force, but by fate. The villagers stepped aside as she entered, the twin anklets wrapped tightly in her shawl. The ground was still damp beneath her feet, but she did not shake. Baba Chinedu raised his staff. "You found what was hidden. You listened when we would not. Now you will place them where truth can rest." The procession began toward the tree. No songs were sung. Only the slow beat of the drum guided them through the path. At the base of the tree, a small shrine was built from clay, ash, and woven palm fronds. Ife stepped forward, placed the anklets inside, and poured oil over them as instructed. Then she spoke the names, Nkiru and Neka, their names once forbidden, now rising into the air like smoke. The ground rumbled faintly, and the tree stood still. For the first time, it did not bleed. When the morning sun touched the village, a strange calm spread with it. The air no longer carried sorrow, only silence, deep, gentle, and full. The tree remained in its place, but the red sap had stopped. Its bark was dry, the earth around it smooth, as though it had been washed clean. Birds returned to its branches. Children walked near without crying, and the whispers that once haunted Ife's nights faded into memory. But something had changed in her. Her hair, once black and thick, now carried streaks of silver that shimmered in the light. She did not speak often, but when she did, her voice held weight, like someone who had touched grief and returned. Her grandmother treated her with quiet reverence, and the villagers who once feared her now greeted her with soft respect. As the seasons passed, the story of the twins was told again, this time not in hushed tones, but around fires and gatherings, as a lesson. The shrine beneath the tree was kept clean, offerings laid gently every moon. No one forgot what fear had cost them. And Aoife, who had once chased a goat too far, became the girl who helped a village find its voice. The tree no longer bled, but its roots held a history that would never be buried again.